4,000 ships gathered at the edge of the Sol system, and it was the largest fleet the Hegemonic Council had assembled in over 1,000 years. Because nothing less would satisfy Zelkoth's demand for absolute victory, the Varani contributed 1,200 vessels, and the Droth brought 800 armored battleships, and the Sylvani added 600 despite their objections, and a dozen other species filled out the rest of the armada that was meant to erase humanity from existence. This is how rebellions end. Zelkoth broadcast to his commanders, with overwhelming force that leaves no doubt about who holds power in this galaxy. What he saw as the fleet advanced was not what he expected, because the Sol system had been transformed into something that his tactical officers could not quite explain. Every moon and asteroid bristled with weapons that had not existed during their last intelligence survey, and defense platforms orbited Earth in numbers that should have been impossible for a species with such limited resources. And waiting among the human vessels were ships from 7 other species that had no business being there. The Kreth, his aide whispered, and the Chiron and the Telvari, and others that I do not even recognize. It does not matter, Zelkoth said firmly. They are still outnumbered 10-1, and all the allies in the galaxy cannot change mathematics. Admiral Yunji Park stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the Council fleet approach with the calm focus that her mother had taught her since childhood. All ships, she broadcast. This is Admiral Park with final orders. She paused and looked at the faces of her crew, seeing fear and pride and determination written in equal measure on their features. We know the odds, she continued, and we know that many of us will not survive this day, but we also know what we are fighting for, and I believe that is enough. The battle began at 0600 hours Earth time, and it was everything that the mathematical models had predicted, and nothing like what either side expected. Council ships advanced in the formation that had crushed 100 rebellions, and human vessels moved to intercept in patterns that seemed chaotic but were actually the result of decades of planning. And the space between Earth and its enemies filled with fire and death. The Kreth fought alongside humanity as if 40 years of alliance had made them brothers. And Commander Threk led his vessels into the heart of the Council formation with weapons blazing and no thought of retreat. And when his flagship was finally destroyed, he was still firing at the enemies who had condemned his people to extinction. The Chiron swarm tactics confused Council gunners who had never faced such coordination. And the ancient Telvari vessels used technology so old that modern sensors could not track them properly. And for the first time in memory, the Council fleet began to suffer losses that exceeded their projections. But it was not enough. Human ships fell by the dozens, and their allies fell with them. And Admiral Yunji Park watched her command display turn red with casualties as the Council's numerical advantage began to tell. Admiral, her communications officer reported, the Sylvani contingent has taken heavy losses, and their commander is requesting permission to withdraw. They will not receive it, the Droth commander announced on the same channel. And any vessel that retreats will be treated as an enemy. The argument that followed split the Council formation in ways that their tactical computers had never anticipated. Because the Sylvani had never trusted the Droth, and the Droth had always looked down on the Sylvani. And now those ancient tensions erupted at the worst possible moment. Yunji saw the gap that opened in the enemy lines and knew that this was the moment her mother had told her about. The moment when everything would be decided. All ships, she ordered, concentrate fire on the Droth command vessel and prepare for close engagement. Her flagship led the charge into the gap, and she knew that she would not survive what came next. But survival had stopped being the point a long time ago. The explosion that destroyed her vessel also destroyed the Droth commander's battleship, and the loss of both leaders at the same moment created chaos that rippled through both fleets. Admiral Soyan Park received word of her daughter's death with a silence that her crew knew better than to interrupt. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Activate the precursor device," she ordered. "It is time to end this." The artifact that humanity had discovered on Mars 30 years ago had puzzled scientists for decades, because it was clearly technology beyond anything they could understand. But it had never shown any function that they could identify. What they had finally learned only 5 years ago was that it was not a weapon of destruction at all. It was a weapon of truth. The device activated with a pulse of energy that spread across the entire solar system and beyond, reaching every ship in the battle and every communications relay in Council space. And what it transmitted was the content of the archives that the Talvari had kept hidden for 10,000 years. Every secret genocide was revealed in detail that could not be denied. And every species that had been erased from history was named and remembered. And every lie that the Council had told to maintain their power was exposed for all the galaxy to see. The Vorani had destroyed 17 civilizations to secure their dominance. And the records included the names of the dead. The Droth had enslaved 6 species and worked them to extinction in their mining operations. And the evidence was undeniable. The Salvani had poisoned entire worlds to eliminate competitors. And the toxins they had used were catalogued with scientific precision. And Zelkoth himself had ordered the plague that had nearly destroyed the Kreth. Not because they were a threat to the galaxy, but because they had refused to give him tribute. The battle stopped as ships on both sides received the transmission. And Council commanders watched their crews stare at the evidence of crimes that they had never known about. And some of those crews began to ask questions that had no good answers. "This changes nothing," Zelkoth broadcast desperately. "These are lies created by our enemies to divide us." But the records were too detailed to be fabricated, and the sources were too credible to be dismissed. And across the galaxy, species that had lived under Council rule for millennia began to understand what had really been done in their name. The Sylvani fleet withdrew without warning, and their commander broadcast a single message before departing. "We did not know," she said, "and we will not fight for those who kept this from us." Other contingents followed, and within hours the great armada that was supposed to destroy humanity had been reduced to less than 1,000 ships crewed by the true believers, who would never accept that their cause was wrong. Those ships were destroyed by the combined forces of humanity and their allies. And when the last Council vessel fell silent, the Sol system was quiet for the first time in days. High Arbiter Zelkoth was captured alive because the humans wanted him to face judgment. And he was brought before a tribunal that included representatives from every species that had suffered under Council rule. The hegemonic Council did not fall in battle, because it fell in shame as species across the galaxy refused to continue supporting an institution built on lies and genocide. And within months, the structure that had ruled for 10,000 years had crumbled into history. 1 year later, Ambassador Unibeak stood before the new Galactic Assembly in a chamber that had been built to replace the one on Varantos Prime. And she looked out at the representatives of 100 species who had gathered to build something new together. A young Varani delegate raised his hand and asked the question that many were wondering. How did humanity know that they could win? He asked, when the odds were so completely against them. Una smiled the same smile that she had worn in the council chamber when they demanded her surrender. And she thought about everyone who had sacrificed everything to reach this moment. "We did not know we could win," she said simply. "We only knew that we would not kneel. And sometimes refusing to kneel is the same thing as winning." She paused and looked at the faces around her. Beings who had been enemies and were now partners in building a better future. "The universe does not always reward the strongest," she continued. "Sometimes it rewards those who refuse to give up." And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand up and say that you will not accept injustice. The assembly was silent for a long moment. And then the young Varani began to applaud, and others joined him. And soon the entire chamber was filled with the sound of species from across the galaxy, honoring the small world that had refused to surrender outside the windows. The stars shone with the same cold light that they had always held, but somehow they seemed brighter now, as if the universe itself was celebrating the beginning of something new. Humanity had come to the stars, expecting to find wonders. And what they had found instead was a galaxy that needed saving. And they had answered that need in the only way they knew how, by being human, and the galaxy would never be the same. Ambassador Una Beak had not rested since the news of Kepler 442 reached Earth. But exhaustion was a luxury that she could not afford when the future of her species hung in the balance, while the future of her species hung in the balance, while the species hung in the balance, while the future of her species hung in the balance. Council celebrated their Pyrrhic victory and tried to suppress the recordings that were spreading across the galaxy. Una was traveling to places that no council member would ever think to look, meeting with representatives of species that official records listed as extinct or irrelevant. You know what they did to the Kreth, she said to a gathering of Talvari elders on their hidden moon. And you know what they would have done to your people if you had not agreed to their terms. 2,000 years ago, the eldest of the Talvari, a being named Velker, who was older than most civilizations, nodded slowly with an expression that mixed sorrow and shame. We remember, he said, and we have regretted our choice every day since we made it. Because survival without freedom is not truly living. Humanity is not asking you to fight our war, Una said carefully. We know that you have sacrificed enough over the millennia, but we are asking you to share what you know about council weaknesses with anyone who wants to listen. Velker studied the small human with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Why would you share such information instead of using it for your own advantage? He asked. Because we learned long ago that tyrants fall faster when everyone pushes together, Una replied. And because we believe that a galaxy where species help each other is better than a galaxy where everyone fights alone. The Talvari Council deliberated for 3 days. And when they finally gave Una their answer, it came with a gift that she had not expected. We have archives that the Council believes were destroyed, Velker told her. Records of their crimes going back 10,000 years, hidden in places where their searches could never reach. He transferred the location data to her secure device and met her eyes with something that looked almost like hope. Use this wisely, he said, and perhaps our shame will finally serve a purpose. Una visited 7 more species in the following weeks, and each meeting followed a similar pattern, because the galaxy was full of beings who had been crushed by council power and were waiting for someone to give them a reason to believe that change was possible. The Kreth fleet emerged from hiding and struck a council supply depot, destroying ships and equipment that would take months to replace. And when the council demanded to know how the quarantined species had acquired such advanced weapons, Commander Threk broadcast his response to every frequency that would carry it. Humanity taught us that survival requires friends, he announced. And we have chosen our friends wisely. The Chiron Collective, silent for a century, began sending encrypted messages to other suppressed species. And the content of those messages was simple but revolutionary. The humans are fighting, the messages said. And they are not fighting alone, within the council itself. The fractures that had always existed beneath the Nevos, the fractures that had always existed beneath the Maya surface of unity began to widen into cracks that threatened the entire structure. This campaign is costing us too much, the Selvani representative argued during an emergency session. We've lost more ships to the humans than we lost in the last 3 rebellions combined. And the occupation of their colony is draining resources that we cannot spare. Then we should strike harder." The Droth representative growled. "Send the full fleet to their home system and end this quickly." "And what if we fail there as well?" the Malorian asked. And the chamber fell silent because no one wanted to consider that possibility. High Arbiter Zelkoth watched his coalition begin to splinter and felt the ground shifting beneath foundations that had stood for 300 years of his rule. "We will not fail," he said firmly, "because we have never failed. And we will not start now." But his voice lacked the certainty that it once carried. And everyone in the chamber could hear the doubt that had crept in around the edges. Back at Sanctuary 7, Admiral Soin Park received reports from the intelligence networks that humanity had built over decades of patient work. And the picture they painted was better than she had dared to hope. "The council is divided," her chief analyst reported. "The Selvani are threatening to withdraw their ships from the combined fleet, and the Droth are demanding complete control of military operations." "What about the other species?" Soyan asked. "The Malorians have quietly pulled their merchant vessels out of council space," the analyst said with a thin smile. "And 3 other species have begun asking questions about what will happen if humanity wins." Soyan nodded and thought about her daughter, Yunji, who had volunteered to command the second fleet despite knowing that it would likely be a suicide mission. Sometimes you have to show people that the impossible is possible, Unji had told her before departing. And sometimes showing is more important than winning. The second fleet launched from Sanctuary 7 with 80 vessels crewed by volunteers, who had written final letters to their families before boarding. And their course was set for Earth, where they would join the final defense of everything humanity had built, Admiral Park. The communications officer announced, "We are receiving a transmission from Ambassador Beak." Yuna's face appeared on the main display, and she looked tired but triumphant. "I have something for you," she said. "The Tovari gave us access to archives that contain 10,000 years of Council secrets, and I think it is time we shared them with the galaxy." Soyan felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest as she understood what Yuna was suggesting. "You want to expose them," she said. "The Council rules through fear and lies," Yuna replied. "And lies only work as long as people believe them." She paused and smiled the smile that had become famous across human space. "I'm going to address the Council one more time," she said, "and I am going to make them an offer they cannot refuse." The transmission that followed reached every member of the hegemonic Council and was broadcast on every public channel, and the Galaxy Ambassador Yuna Beak stood before the camera with the calm confidence of someone who held cards that no one else knew about. And she spoke directly to the beings who had demanded her species surrender. "You demanded our submission," she said, "and we have considered your offer carefully, but we have decided to make a counteroffer instead." She paused and let the words hang in the silence. "Withdraw your forces from our territory and dissolve the tier system that has oppressed countless species for 10,000 years. She continued, "Do this, and we will welcome you as equals in a new galactic community." She leaned forward slightly, and her smile grew cold. "Refuse," she said, "and we will show the galaxy exactly what kind of beings you really are." In the council chamber, Zelkoth watched the transmission with growing fury and fear, because he recognized the threat behind her words. The humans had found something, and whatever it was could destroy everything he had built. "Assemble the full fleet," he ordered. "We will crush them at their homeworld and end this rebellion once and for all." But even as he gave the command, he could not shake the feeling that humanity had been waiting for exactly this moment. High Arbiter Zelkoth had ruled the Council for 300 years by understanding a simple truth about power, which was that it needed to be demonstrated regularly or it would begin to fade in the minds of those who witnessed it. He did not wait for humanity's formal response to the ultimatum, because waiting would suggest that the Council actually cared what a Tier 9 species decided. And instead he called an emergency session to authorize what he called a demonstration of resolve. The humans have shown disrespect to this body, he announced to the assembled representatives. And such disrespect cannot be allowed to spread to other species, who might begin to question our authority. The Droth representative pounded his armored fist against his platform in agreement, and the Selvani hissed their approval. And within the hour, a fleet of 300 Council warships was moving toward the human colony at Kepler 442. It was meant to be a simple operation that would end with human colonists in custody, and a clear message sent to the rest of the galaxy. But things did not go the way Zelkoth expected. Governor Minje-Do received warning of the approaching fleet from the network of hidden sensors that humanity had scattered throughout its territory, and he had almost 16 hours to prepare before the first Council ship entered the system. "We have 47 combat vessels," his defense coordinator reported, "against 300 enemy ships with superior weapons and shields. So the mathematical outcome is certain. Mathematics never won a war by itself," Minje replied calmly. And neither did certainty. He opened a broadcast channel to every human on the colony, and spoke in the same steady voice that his father had used during the famines of his childhood. When survival depended on refusing to give in to despair, "The Council is coming to take our home," he said simply. "They expect us to surrender because they believe we are weak and afraid, but they do not know us. And they do not know what we are willing to do to protect what we love." He paused and looked at the faces of his staff, seeing fear and determination mixed together in equal measure. "No one will think less of anyone who chooses to evacuate," he continued. "But I am staying, and I believe in my heart that we are going to show the galaxy something it has never seen before." When the Council fleet arrived, they found the human defenders waiting in a formation that their tactical computers identified as completely inadequate. And the commander of the assault force, a Vorani admiral named Kethros, felt a moment of something like pity for the small creatures who had chosen to die rather than accept their fate. "Open a communication channel," he ordered, "and tell them that surrender is still an option if they act immediately." The response came from a human woman whose name was Yoonji Shin, and she was the captain of the destroyer that sat at the center of the human formation, Admiral Kethros. She said with a slight smile that reminded Kethros of the human ambassador, "I appreciate the offer, but we are going to have to decline. You cannot possibly believe you can win this engagement," Kethros said, genuinely confused by her tone. "Winning is not always about destroying more ships than you lose," Eunji replied. "Sometimes winning is about showing the universe that you will not break, no matter what." The channel closed and the battle began. Council weapons were indeed superior, and their shields were stronger, and their numbers were overwhelming, just as the mathematical analysis had predicted. And human ships began to die within the first minutes of combat. But something strange happened that Kethros had not anticipated, because the humans did not break. Every destroyed vessel fought until its final moment, and pilots whose ships were crippled beyond repair did not eject to save themselves, but instead aimed their burning hulls at Council cruisers and accelerated to maximum speed. And the explosions that resulted took enemy ships with them into death. "They are insane," Kethros whispered as he watched another human destroyer ram itself into one of his battleships. "Why do they not surrender?" The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it was over, the human fleet had been reduced to 11 functioning vessels. But the Council had lost 61 ships, which was more than they had lost in any single engagement in over a century. Ground forces landed on the colony, expecting to find a population ready to submit. And instead they found resistance that seemed to come from everywhere at once. because every building contained hidden weapons and every civilian knew how to use them within 3 days of the occupation. Council forces controlled less than 40% of the colony, and their casualties were mounting at a rate that made their commanders increasingly nervous. "They fight like animals," a Sylvani officer reported to Kethros. "We capture one position and they appear in 3 others. And they do not seem to care about their own lives." Kethros did not know what to say, because nothing in his 300 years of military experience had prepared him for an enemy that simply refused to accept defeat. What he did not know was that 3 Kreth stealth vessels had been observing the entire battle from the edge of the system, and their commanders were recording everything they witnessed for transmission to every corner of the galaxy. The message that spread in the following days was simple but powerful, because it showed something that the Council had worked very hard to make sure no one ever saw. It showed that they could bleed. On a dozen worlds where species lived under Council rule, beings watched the recordings of human ships fighting against impossible odds. And they watched colonists refuse to submit, even when submission was the only rational choice. And something began to stir in hearts that had been quiet for generations. The Malorian trade networks buzzed with discussion about what the humans had done. And many of the merchants who had always followed Council directives began to ask questions that they had never dared to ask before. The Insectoid Chiron Collective, which had been silent for 100 years after their own failed rebellion, sent a message to the Kreth vessels that had distributed the recordings. "Tell the humans that we remember when they traded fairly with us." The message said, "Tell them that we are watching and we are thinking about what we see." Governor Minjae Do was captured on the 4th day of the occupation, and he was brought before Admiral Kethros in chains. "Your resistance has cost your people greatly," Kethros said, trying to understand what could possibly motivate such behavior. Was it worth the suffering? Minjae looked up at the towering Varani with eyes that held no fear. "You still do not understand," he said quietly. "You think that suffering is the worst thing that can happen to us. But there are worse things than suffering. What could be worse than the destruction of your people?" Kethros asked. "Living on our knees," Minjae replied. "That would be worse." Kethros stared at the small human for a long time. And for the first time in centuries, he felt something that he did not recognize at first, because it had been so long since he had experienced it. It was doubt. The recordings continued to spread across the galaxy, and the Council's carefully constructed image of invincible power began to crack. And in hidden places where oppressed species gathered to whisper their hopes, a new word began to be spoken. That word was humanity. 12 years before the Council delivered its ultimatum, a Malorian trade vessel had made first contact with humanity at the edge of the Sol system. And that moment had changed everything for the small blue world called Earth. The Malorians had been friendly in their own, calculating way, and they had explained the structure of galactic civilization with the patience of teachers, who expected their students to accept their lessons without question. But humanity had listened with different ears than the Malorians expected. Defense Minister Ji-Hoon Kang remembered reading those first reports from the contact team and feeling a cold knot form in his stomach, because the picture they painted was not the hopeful vision of galactic brotherhood that science fiction had promised for so long. The galaxy was ruled by the Hegemonic Council, a body of 12 powerful species that had maintained order for over 10,000 years. And their method was simple and brutal in its efficiency, because every new spacefaring civilization was classified into tiers that determined what they could do, where they could go, and how much they were worth in the grand calculation of galactic politics. Species that accepted their classification and followed the rules were allowed to exist in peace, and species that resisted were crushed with overwhelming force until they learned their place or ceased to exist entirely. "We saw the pattern immediately," Ji-Hoon said now. standing in the command center of Luna Base as screens around him flickered with status reports from across human space. Every species that joined the Council on their terms eventually became dependent on them, and every species that refused was destroyed. His aide, a young officer named Hai-Jin Moon, nodded as she pulled up historical data from the Malorian archives that human hackers had quietly copied years ago. The Kreth were the most recent example before we arrived, she said. They refused to accept Tier 7 classification because it would have required them to give up their colony worlds. So the Council engineered a plague and released it on their homeworld. Quarantine was just another word for genocide. Ji-hoon agreed. And the rest of the galaxy was told that the Kreth had brought it on themselves through their own stubbornness. He turned to look at the massive display that showed the current position of every human vessel in the galaxy. And each one was marked with a small symbol that only a handful of people knew how to read. Phase 1 is active, he announced to the room. All Nightfall assets are now authorized for deployment. Project Nightfall had been humanity's greatest secret for 2 decades. And it had been built on a simple observation that Ji-hoon had made during his first briefing on galactic civilization. Because the Council was powerful, but they were also arrogant. And arrogance always created blind spots. Every human colony had been designed to look primitive and inefficient by galactic standards, with buildings that seemed too large for their purpose and infrastructure that appeared wasteful and poorly planned. But the reality was very different from what Council inspectors saw during their occasional visits. Beneath the surface of every colony were hidden weapons systems, shield generators, and communication networks that could transform a peaceful settlement into a fortress within hours. And all of it had been built using techniques that Council technology could not detect because they had never imagined that a Tier 9 species would be clever enough to deceive them. The Council thinks we spent the last 40 years trying to catch up to their technology, Ji-hoon said with a grim smile. They have no idea that we spent those years learning how to beat their technology on the other side of the solar system, in an asteroid field that official records listed as too unstable for mining operations. Admiral Soin Park was reviewing the final status reports from Sanctuary 7. The hidden base had been carved out of a massive asteroid over 15 years of careful work, and it contained the second fleet that no one outside of the highest levels of Earth's government knew existed, because building it had required deception on a scale that would have seemed impossible to any species that had not grown up on a world where survival often depended on hiding. Your true strength. 87. Vessels ready for deployment, her executive officer reported. All crews are at battle stations and waiting for orders. Soin nodded and thought about the odds they were facing. Because the Council could field thousands of ships against humanity's combined fleet of less than 200. And by any rational calculation, their chances of victory were close to 0. But humans had never been very good at rational calculations when it came to freedom. Open a channel to our allies, she ordered. It is time to let them know that we are keeping our promises. The message that went out was encrypted with codes that human and Kreth engineers had developed together during the secret meetings that had taken place over the last decade. And it reached a fleet of 40 vessels that had been hiding in the depths of interstellar space. Commander Threk of the Kreth Collective read the message and felt something that his species had not experienced in 200 years of quarantine and despair, because the humans had not forgotten them, and the humans were not going to abandon them. They are really going to fight, his second officer said with wonder in her voice. They know they cannot win, and they are going to fight anyway. That is why we chose them as allies, Threk replied. Because they understand something that the Council has forgotten. He stood and looked out at the stars that his people had once explored freely before the Council decided that they were too dangerous to be allowed such freedom. Sometimes the fight itself is the victory, he said. And sometimes all you need to do is show the galaxy that the Council can bleed. Back on Earth, news of the ultimatum had spread across every continent within hours of Ambassador Beak's return. And the response had surprised no one who understood what humanity had become during its brief time among the stars. There was no panic in the streets, and there were no desperate calls for surrender, because the people of Earth had grown up knowing that this day would come, and they had been preparing for it in their own ways for their entire lives. Enlistment centers that had been quiet for years were suddenly overwhelmed with volunteers, and factories that had been producing civilian goods began the conversion to military production that their designs had always allowed for. And in homes and schools and workplaces across the planet, people simply looked at each other and nodded. They would not kneel. Minister Kang received the final tally of volunteer applications at midnight Earth time, and the number was so large that he had to read it twice before he believed it. 400% increase in 12 hours. Haijin reported. And the numbers are still climbing. Ji-hoon closed his eyes and thought about his grandmother, who had lived through wars and famines and never once gave up hope. And he thought about his children, who would inherit whatever future humanity managed to create in the coming days. Tell Admiral Park that we are ready, he said quietly. The Council wanted to see what humanity was made of, and now they are going to find out. In her command center at Sanctuary 7, Soyeon Park received the message and smiled the same smile that Ambassador Beak had worn in the Council chamber. They think we are afraid because we are small, she said to her crew. They have no idea what small and desperate can do. She opened a channel to the fleet and spoke the words that would begin the next chapter of human history. All ships, she announced. This is Admiral Park with operational orders. And as of this moment, we are at war. The stars seemed to grow brighter in that moment, as if the universe itself was watching to see what would happen next. The Galactic Coordination Chamber was the largest structure ever built by any species in the known galaxy, and it was designed to make visitors feel small, which was exactly how the Hegemonic Council wanted every newcomer to feel when they walked through its ancient doors. Ambassador Yuna Beak stood at the center of the chamber and looked up at the 12 towering platforms where the representatives of the galaxy's most powerful species sat in judgment, and she felt the weight of their stares pressing down on her like a physical force. But she did not let it show on her face. The Varani were the oldest of the Council species, and their High Arbiter Zelkoth had held his position for over 300 standard years, which made him one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. And right now his 4 eyes were fixed on the small human delegation with what could only be described as contempt. You stand before the Hegemonic Council to answer for the crimes of your species, Zelkoth announced, his voice booming through the chamber with the help of translation, technology that made his words clear to every being present. Humanity has violated 17 articles of the Galactic Compact since your admission to the spacefaring community. 43 standard years ago, Yuna kept her expression neutral as one of her aides, a young man named Taiwan Gil, handed her a tablet with notes she did not need because she had memorized every accusation the Council might throw at them. Your species has interfered with established trade routes that have operated without disruption for over 2,000 years. Zelkoth continued, reading from a document that glowed blue in the dim light of the chamber. You have colonized 3 systems that fall within contested territories without seeking proper authorization from this body. The Malorian representative, a being that resembled a tall praying mantis made of crystal, clicked its mandibles in what might have been agreement or simply impatience. But your most serious violation, Zelkoth said, and his voice dropped to a tone that suggested deep offense, is your unauthorized contact with the Kreth Collective. a species that this council quarantined for the safety of all galactic civilizations. 200 years ago, Yuna heard Taiwan shift nervously behind her. But she remained still because showing any reaction would be a sign of weakness in this room full of predators who wore the masks of diplomats. You provided them with medical supplies, the Selvani representative hissed from her platform, her serpentine body coiling with barely contained anger. You gave them technology to cure the plague that was finally going to end their threat to the galaxy. The plague was killing 90% of their population, Yuna said calmly, speaking for the first time since the session began. They asked for help, and we helped them. A ripple of shock moved through the chamber, because junior species were expected to listen and accept judgment, not to speak out of turn. You admit to this crime openly, Zelkoth said. And there was something like surprise in his ancient voice. You do not even attempt to deny what you have done. There is nothing to deny, Yuna replied. We saw people dying, and we had the ability to save them. So we saved them, and we would do it again. The Droth representative, a massive creature covered in armored plates that made him look like a living tank, slammed one of his fists against his platform with enough force to echo through the entire chamber. This is exactly the problem with these humans, he growled. They do not understand their place in the natural order of things, and they do not respect the authority of this council. We respect authority that is earned through fairness, Yuna said. We do not respect authority that is maintained through fear and the suffering of innocent beings. For a long moment, the chamber was completely silent, and Yuna could feel the tension building like a storm about to break. Enough, Zelkoth finally said, raising one of his forearms in a gesture that demanded silence. We did not summon humanity here to debate philosophy, and we will now deliver the judgment of this council. He unrolled another glowing document and began to read in formal tones. That had been used to deliver similar judgments to dozens of species over thousands of years. The hegemonic council hereby demands the complete and unconditional surrender of the human species, he announced. All human colonies and assets beyond your home system will be transferred to council administration within 30 standard rotations. Yuna listened without expression as the demands continued. All human military vessels will be decommissioned and their weapon systems disabled under council supervision. And your population will submit to monitoring technology to ensure compliance with your new status as a Tier 9 civilization. Tier 9, the Malorian representative added with clear satisfaction, means you will have no voice in galactic affairs, no right to expand beyond your single system, and no access to technology above basic interstellar travel, which is more than you deserve, but we are merciful should you refuse these terms, Zelkoth concluded. The combined fleet of the Hegemonic Council will execute corrective action against your species, and I assure you that such action will be swift and absolute. He set down the document and fixed all four of his eyes on Yuna with an intensity that had made stronger beings crumble. You have 30 rotations to comply, he said. What is humanity's response? Every being in the chamber leaned forward slightly, because this was the moment when new species always broke. When they realized the true power of the council and accepted their fate with whatever dignity they could. Manage Yuna Beak took a slow breath and looked up at the towering platforms that surrounded her, at the representatives of species that had ruled the galaxy for millennia, at beings who had crushed rebellions and ended civilizations, and never once faced a challenge they could not overcome. And then she smiled. We will need to discuss this with our people, she said in a tone that was almost pleasant. Democracy can be slow sometimes, and I hope you understand. She paused and let her smile grow just a little wider. But I can tell you right now, she added, the answer is going to be interesting. The council members exchanged confused looks, because this was not how the script was supposed to go. And Zelkoth made a dismissive gesture with one of his arms. "You have 30 rotations," he repeated. "Use them wisely." Yuna bowed in the formal manner that Galactic Protocol required and turned to lead her delegation out of the chamber. And not once did she look back at the beings who believed they had just sealed humanity's fate. When her shuttle cleared the docking bay of Varantos Prime, and the stars spread out before them in all their cold glory, Taiwan finally let out the breath he had been holding. "Ambassador," he said quietly, "are we actually going to surrender?" Yuna opened a secure communication channel and waited for the encryption to confirm before she spoke. "Earth Command," she said. "This is Ambassador Beak with a priority message for all defense coordinators." A voice crackled back through the speaker. Steady and calm despite the weight of the moment. "We read you, Ambassador. And we are ready to receive." Yuna looked out at the stars that humanity had spent so long dreaming about before they finally reached them. And she thought about all the generations who had looked up at the night sky and wondered if they were alone. "They took the bait," she said simply. "Begin Phase 1. Taiwan stared at her with wide eyes as the channel closed and the shuttle turned toward home. "Ambassador," he whispered. "What exactly is Phase 1? Yuna leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes with the smile still playing on her lips. "The Council thinks they know what we are," she said softly. "They are about to learn how wrong they have been.